everyone. Today we'll be exploring the question, what can the history and geography tell us about the current revolutionary and socialist countries in Latin America? And to answer it, we'll be using a map that I made as a tool to understand the political history and geographic inequality and how that shapes healthcare today. Alright, so first let me talk about why geography matters in this conversation, and that's because the delivery of healthcare, education, and the execution of the government depends heavily on geography, especially in Latin America. There are so many rural areas, rural communities, and they're also divided up rural and urban between indigenous groups who usually live in rural areas, and that adds another layer of how geography is impacting the government and healthcare and education. And historically, these colonial and post-colonial states, which most of Latin America is, have prioritized urban and export-oriented zones and left the rest behind. And that's still true in so many Latin American countries. A lot of the ones that we're going to talk about today have urban areas that are developed, and then the rest of the country is rural, and in terms of healthcare is not quite as developed as the rest of the country. But oftentimes in Latin America, that's also where revolutions come from, is from the rural areas. First, I'm going to point out some socialist revolutions or elected governments in Latin America. And these just don't happen randomly. They're happening in places where public health is poor and where wealth is concentrated in just a few hands. And we can see that through some of the aspects of this map. First of all, Cuba, 1959. Their revolution was rooted in rural poverty and U.S. economic control. Nicaragua, 1979. The Sandinistas also come from the countryside and was a response to dictatorship. Evo Morales in Bolivia, 2006. He has a basis in indigenous peasant movements in the Andes Mountains, which is really specific to Bolivia because there's a big indigenous population there. We can also talk about Venezuela, 1999. Hugo Chavez capitalized on resentment of oil wealth inequality, so that was also socialist in nature. And what we can take away from this map is that it kind of mirrors a map of inequality and exclusion. We can see that a lot of the Human Development Index, HDI countries, the lower HDI countries, are ones that I've selected for analysis for their revolutions, except for Cuba, which is in the same range as Brazil and Mexico and Costa Rica. So in these socialist revolution countries, we can see that they're happening in places in rural areas, farther away from capital cities, farther away from healthcare systems, and a lot of times coming from issues of land ownership. We can also look at doctors per capita as a measurement for their development, and we can look at it through the lens of revolution. Each of these people represents one doctor per 1,000 people. I do want to say that I incorrectly did this part of Central America. I was just reading my data wrong. These should be 0.6 of a person instead of 6, and this should be about 0.4 instead of 4.5. Specifically about some of these countries and their doctors per capita, first we can point out, of course, Cuba has so much more than everyone else. They have the most doctors per capita in all of Latin America. That is because they focus so much of their GDP on healthcare, and it's really more of a political tool than it is fully just for the social good. We can also look at the countries here in South America that had some socialist movements that have a lot less doctors than other countries in their area. Many of these countries did have leftist movements, but just the ones that I've selected here are some of the ones that we did in class and some of the ones that are the more famous ones. And we can see that Bolivia certainly has less doctors per capita than other countries, as does Venezuela. And this number is probably lower now than when the data was collected that I found. But why this number matters is that so many revolutions in Latin America are focused around healthcare, and you can really see which countries are really focusing on that in their revolutionary sense, and which countries didn't even really have the same style of revolution as Cuba, so maybe weren't able to devote the full, all of their resources to it. But it was a revolutionary demand, and it still is today. Let's take a moment to speak about HDI, that's Human Development Index. I have all the countries labeled here. More green is a lower Human Development Index, and down here to purple is the highest, and then the blue and the teal are more in the middle. There is a key down here for all of the information. HDI includes life expectancy, education, and income, and part of why that's important is that these are the exact things that force countries into revolutions. Especially in Latin America, the life expectancy and the health aspect is really important, as is education and income. Especially in a socialist revolution, you're going to see a lot of healthcare, education, and salary equality as part of the demands. This was especially true Cuba, very socialist, orthodox revolution. Some of these newer ones are more a different style of leftism. A lot of them do have socialist tendencies, but they're not necessarily having a full socialized healthcare system, full socialized education system. But these are also the aspects that HDI looks at. And so through a funded healthcare and education system, we can see that Cuba is the darker blue color and does have a pretty high HDI. As does Chile, has the highest HDI in South America from the data that I found. But Bolivia and Venezuela, which had more recent revolutions, have lower HDIs. And I think part of that is because the revolution happened because of these lower HDI situations, poor education, poor income, poor life expectancy, and that's what caused the revolution, and they haven't had time to build up a socialized medicine system that really works, especially in Venezuela. That's true. Now, to look more deeply into the historical aspect of things, I'd like to go a little bit into a case study of malaria in South America. And I want to use this as a case study just because South America has been a continent defined by disease outbreaks ever since the Europeans came over and smallpox came about. So I think it's just so ingrained in the culture and the people's minds. So I'd like to use malaria to look country by country and see if we can draw any connections between socialist revolutions or the political state in those countries now and how they dealt with the malaria outbreaks. Cuba specifically reported that they eradicated malaria in 1967, which was shortly after the revolution. And before that, they did have one of the earlier dates of administering medicines and cures for it. And Costa Rica and Chile followed close behind. Chile was one of our countries that we looked at as having an elected leftist government. And I think part of that is that we're seeing the countries who specifically centralize their public health efforts against malaria also tend to be the ones with leftist governments, and especially more famous ones like Cuba and Chile. There are parts of Honduras and Nicaragua that still face outbreaks, as well as the Amazon basin. And I think it's important that Nicaragua is one of our countries that we looked at as having a revolution, but they still have malaria outbreaks. And I think we can also look at that as possibly being a reason for needing healthcare reforms and having a revolution in the first place, is that they saw people dying of a preventable disease and wanted to see improvements in their healthcare system. And that could have also been true in Cuba, as we didn't see them reporting eradicating malaria until after the 10 years beyond the revolution. And to start wrapping things up, revolutionary history has been one way that Latin American countries have been trying to rebuild the state and serve rural and poor populations, which has been an issue since the Europeans came to colonialize South America. The rural populations have been neglected, but many of the revolutions are about involving those people in society, especially in healthcare. And the reason that I pulled out a map for this project was that I think that geography really matters. The jungles, the mountains, I wish that I could have had so many more aspects on this map. Physical geography, I wish that I could have looked at vaccination rates as well. There's only so much paper, but I do really think that geography matters, and especially in Latin American countries with these rural areas, getting to these isolated communities requires intentional policy, as well as having the financial and the logistical capacity to reach those people. And I think that that's what many of these revolutions are about creating that intention within the government, and forcing a larger portion of funds and time to be allocated to rural, especially indigenous populations. Political will is the key. We can definitely see that with Cuba. They aren't the most financially successful country in Latin America, but they have created so many physicians per capita and funneled so much of their GDP into healthcare. And it just shows that when the political intention is there and the revolution is really, really centered around healthcare, Latin American countries can get to the point where they have a successful, in depending on your parameters, a successful healthcare revolution. We also see through the maps that we can see where health and development have advanced and where geographic and political neglect still dominate, meaning that using this map we can see what countries are financially successful, but also which countries are leading in healthcare, and do those always overlap? Or sometimes are there countries that have a higher HDI, but they don't necessarily have that developed of a healthcare system, even though it's part of the HDI. Maybe their financial freedom is just pulling the HDI up, but they're really not helping with healthcare for poor and rural populations. All right, and to finish things off, I think my final statement is going to be that revolutions in Latin America were not just about ideology, but they were about bringing care back in and intentionally claiming space, physical or otherwise, for the people who have been left in colonial and post-colonial times off of the map of care. And that's why I chose to use a map. And thank you so much. And if you have any questions about my map, just email me.